Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden behind the walls we're most afraid to enter. Marcus Blackwood learned this truth as he stood in the Scottish Highland mist, staring at the crumbling fortress that everyone in the village of Glen Morvern said would be his financial ruin. The ancient stone walls of Ravenshollow Castle stretched before him like the skeleton of some long-dead giant, its towers broken and windows dark as hollow eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Moss clung to the weathered stones, and ivy had claimed entire sections of the outer walls. The iron gates hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the courtyard was choked with weeds that had grown tall enough to hide a child. His 8-year-old son, Jamie, kicked at loose stones in the overgrown path, his curiosity undaunted by the castle's intimidating appearance. The boy's bright green eyes darted from one crumbling detail to another, seeing adventure where adults saw only decay and expense. The villagers had made their opinions abundantly clear during Marcus's brief stop at the local pub. Old Hamish MacLeod, who claimed his family had lived in Glen Morvern for 6 centuries, had shaken his head with the authority of someone who'd watched many foolish decisions unfold. "That cursed pile of stones has been the death of every man who tried to claim it," he'd declared, his weathered hands wrapped around a pint of ale. "Your great-uncle Alistair was the last fool to think he could tame Ravenshollow. Spent 40 years throwing good money after bad, and what did he have to show for it? Nothing but debt and disappointment." The other patrons had nodded their agreement, sharing stories of the castle's long decline from medieval stronghold to romantic ruin to modern burden. They spoke of structural problems that would cost hundreds of thousands to repair, of heating bills that would bankrupt a millionaire, of historical preservation requirements that made any practical renovation impossible. Their message was unanimous: sell quickly, take whatever money he could get, and count himself lucky to escape the castle's curse. But something in Jamie's excited voice as he called out about strange carvings on the gatehouse walls made Marcus pause. The boy possessed his mother's gift for finding beauty in unexpected places, for seeing possibility where others saw only problems. What if this crumbling fortress held secrets that the villagers had never discovered? What if the very burden everyone warned him about might somehow become their salvation? Marcus Blackwood had never imagined his life would take such a dramatic turn. Just 6 months ago, he'd been living comfortably in Edinburgh, working as a museum curator at the National Gallery, surrounded by the art and artifacts that had always been his passion. His wife Catherine had been the practical one in their marriage, managing their finances with the precision of the accountant she'd trained to be before Jamie was born. Together, they'd built a stable, predictable life in their suburban home, complete with weekend trips to the countryside and plans for Jamie's education at the best schools they could afford. Then the diagnosis had changed everything. Cancer, aggressive and swift, had taken Catherine within 8 months of that first doctor's visit. The medical bills, even with insurance, had consumed their savings and forced Marcus to mortgage their home beyond its value. When Catherine died, Marcus found himself not only grieving the loss of his soulmate, but facing financial ruin that threatened to cost him everything they'd built together. The curator position that had once seemed secure became precarious as budget cuts swept through Scotland's cultural institutions. Marcus watched colleagues with decades of experience lose their positions, and he realized that his own job hung by an increasingly thin thread. The salary that had been comfortable for a family of 3 proved inadequate for a single father trying to maintain their previous standard of living while paying for childcare and the mounting debts Catherine's illness had left behind. Jamie handled his mother's death with the resilience that children sometimes show in the face of incomprehensible loss. At 8 years old, he possessed an imagination that could transform their cramped Edinburgh flat into castles, spaceships, or detective headquarters, depending on the day's adventure. He'd inherited Catherine's practical optimism and Marcus's love of history, creating elaborate stories about ancient warriors and hidden treasures that reminded Marcus why he'd fallen in love with the past in the first place. The boy's auburn hair and freckled face were pure Catherine, but his eyes held Marcus's deep curiosity and his stubborn refusal to accept that interesting things were always beyond reach. When other children might have been overwhelmed by grief and uncertainty, Jamie threw himself into learning about Scottish history, partly to connect with his father's work, and partly because the stories of brave Highland warriors gave him heroes to admire during a time when the adult world seemed frighteningly unpredictable. The letter from Alistair Blackwood's solicitor had arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a clerk who seemed surprised to find Marcus in such modest circumstances. The elderly lawyer, Mr. Sinclair, had explained that Marcus was the sole heir to his great-uncle's estate, including Ravenshollow Castle and its surrounding lands in the Scottish Highlands. The inheritance was substantial in terms of property but came with debts, maintenance costs, and legal obligations that made it more burden than blessing. Alistair Blackwood had been the eccentric branch of the family tree, a man who'd spent his life trying to restore a medieval castle that most people considered beyond salvation. He'd never married, never had children, and had lived as something of a hermit in the partially habitable sections of the fortress. Marcus remembered meeting him only once, at a family gathering when Marcus was perhaps 10 years old, and recalled a tall, serious man with intense gray eyes who'd spoken passionately about Scottish history and the importance of preserving the past for future generations. The drive north from Edinburgh to Glen Morvern had taken them through some of Scotland's most spectacular countryside, but Marcus had been too preoccupied with practical concerns to enjoy the scenery. The castle came with 17 acres of highland terrain, but it also came with property taxes, insurance requirements, and maintenance obligations that his meager savings couldn't begin to address. The sensible thing would be to sell immediately to one of the developers who'd already expressed interest, take the money, and use it to start fresh somewhere more affordable. But standing in the castle's overgrown courtyard, watching Jamie explore with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood, Marcus found himself remembering why he'd become a museum curator in the first place. History wasn't just about preserving old objects behind glass. It was about maintaining connections between past and present, about ensuring that the stories of previous generations continued to inspire and instruct those who came after. "Dad, look at this!" Jamie called from the base of the castle's main tower, where he'd been examining the stonework with the intensity of a professional archaeologist. "These aren't just regular stones. See how some of them have marks that look like they were carved on purpose?" Marcus approached his son's discovery, noting how the afternoon light caught subtle differences in the ancient masonry. To most observers, the variations would look like natural weathering or random damage from centuries of highland storms. But Jamie's observation was acute. Some of the marks did appear deliberate, following patterns that suggested human intention rather than natural decay. "You might be right," Marcus said, running his fingers over the carved symbols. His years of training in art history had taught him to distinguish between accidental damage and purposeful design. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And these marks definitely fell into the latter category. Your great-uncle Alistair mentioned in some of his letters that the castle held secrets most people never discovered. That wasn't entirely accurate. The few communications Marcus had received from his great-uncle over the years had been brief and formal, focusing on family history and genealogical details rather than specific information about Ravenshollow Castle. But Alistair had always hinted that the fortress was more significant than local opinion suggested, that its apparent decline masked a deeper importance that only a true guardian could uncover. The castle's history stretched back to the 13th century, when the first Blackwood laird had built the original keep as a stronghold against both English invaders and rival Scottish clans. Over the centuries, successive generations had added towers, walls, and residential quarters, creating a complex that had once housed hundreds of people and controlled the strategic pass through the surrounding mountains. But the castle's golden age had ended with the Jacobite risings of the 18th century. The Blackwood family's support for Bonnie Prince Charlie had resulted in their lands being forfeit to the crown, and while they'd eventually regained ownership through legal maneuvering and political connections, the fortress had never recovered its former prosperity. By the 19th century, it had become a romantic ruin, admired by tourists but no longer inhabited except by caretakers and the occasional eccentric heir who dreamed of restoration. Marcus pulled out his phone to photograph the carved symbols Jamie had discovered, noting how the device's flash revealed details that natural light had obscured. The marks formed a pattern that seemed to follow the tower's circumference, as if someone had created a coded message that could only be read by walking completely around the structure. "Dad, there's a door over here that looks different from the others," Jamie announced, his exploration having taken him to the tower's far side. It's got this weird lock thing, and it's not all rusty like the other metal parts. Following his son's voice, Marcus discovered a narrow wooden door set deep into the tower's base, protected from the weather by the overhanging stones above. Unlike the castle's main entrances, which had been secured with obvious modern locks, this door featured an intricate mechanism that looked far older than its surprisingly good condition would suggest. The lock was circular, made of brass that had developed a green patina but remained functional. Instead of a keyhole, it featured a series of rotating discs, each inscribed with symbols that matched the carvings Jamie had found on the tower walls. A heraldic shield, a Highland dirk, a Celtic cross, and what appeared to be a raven in flight. Marcus studied the mechanism with growing excitement. Medieval puzzle locks were rare and valuable, both as historical artifacts and as evidence of the sophisticated craftsmanship that had flourished in Scotland's castle-building period. But more importantly, the lock's excellent condition suggested that someone had been maintaining it, caring for it, treating it as something precious rather than merely decorative. Jamie pulled out his phone, a hand-me-down device that Marcus couldn't afford to replace but couldn't bear to take away, knowing how much the boy treasured his ability to document their discoveries. "I'm going to take pictures of everything," he announced with the seriousness of a professional researcher. "Mom always said the best adventures start with good documentation." The mention of Catherine sent the familiar pang of loss through Marcus's chest, but it was accompanied by something else. Pride in how thoroughly Jamie had absorbed his parents. Lessons about the importance of careful observation and systematic investigation. The boy was developing into a natural historian, driven by the same curiosity and respect for the past that had shaped Marcus's own career. They spent the next 2 hours exploring the castle's exterior, Jamie photographing every unusual detail while Marcus tried to make sense of what they were discovering. Ravenshollow was clearly far older and more complex than the historical records suggested. The architectural styles represented multiple building periods, with evidence of construction techniques that spanned several centuries. Most intriguingly, the castle showed signs of modification that had nothing to do with military defense or residential comfort. Hidden chambers, concealed passages, and disguised entrances suggested that sometime in its history, Ravenshollow had been adapted for purposes that required secrecy and concealment. Mrs. Ferguson from the village's only bed and breakfast had been quite clear about the local opinion during their check-in conversation. "That castle's been nothing but trouble for anyone daft enough to think they could make something of it," she'd said while showing them to their room. "Your great-uncle spent a fortune on surveys and restoration plans, but he never got anywhere. The place is too far gone, and the costs would bankrupt anyone who tried to bring it back." Her assessment wasn't wrong about the financial challenges. Marcus had spent his drive north calculating and recalculating the basic costs of making the castle habitable, and the numbers were staggering. New roofing alone would cost more than he could earn in several years. And that was before addressing the plumbing, heating, electrical systems, and structural repairs that would be necessary for basic safety. But Mrs. Ferguson's dismissal of the castle's potential didn't account for what Marcus was beginning to suspect about Ravenshallow's true significance. The careful preservation of certain architectural elements, the sophisticated security measures, and the evidence of ongoing maintenance suggested that someone had been protecting secrets that the local community didn't know existed. As the Highland evening approached and the mist began to rise from the surrounding mountains, Marcus found himself thinking about possibility rather than problems. The castle might be crumbling and expensive, but it was also authentic, complete, and apparently full of mysteries that no one had bothered to investigate thoroughly. "Dad, I think I figured out how to work that weird door lock," Jamie called from the tower's base, where he'd been studying his photographs and comparing them to close-up images of the carved symbols. "These pictures, they tell a story. If you put them in the right order, I think they might open the door." Marcus walked over to where his son stood, noting how the fading light made the carved symbols appear deeper and more deliberate. Whatever Alistair had left them, whatever secrets Ravenshollow Castle contained, Marcus was beginning to understand that the real inheritance might not be the building itself, but the opportunity to discover what generations of previous owners had protected and preserved. The brass mechanism clicked with surprising smoothness as Jamie rotated the discs according to his interpretation of the symbolic sequence. Shield, dirk, cross, raven. The lock opened with a sound that seemed to echo through centuries of silence, and the wooden door swung inward on hinges that moved without the protests Marcus would have expected, from hardware that was supposedly medieval. Cool air flowed out from the darkness beyond, carrying scents of old stone and something else. Something that reminded Marcus of the rare book collection at the National Gallery, full of ancient documents and carefully preserved treasures that most people never got to see. "Dad, it worked," Jamie whispered, his voice trembling with excitement as the narrow door revealed a passage that disappeared into the tower's interior. "There's really a secret door, just like in the stories." Marcus retrieved the powerful flashlight they'd brought from their car, its beam revealing stone steps that curved upward into the tower's heart. The craftsmanship was remarkable, each step carved from a single block of highland granite and fitted so precisely that no mortar had been necessary. This wasn't medieval construction, it was medieval artistry, the work of master masons who had built not just for function but for permanence. "This passage isn't on any of the architectural plans I've seen," Marcus murmured, his historian's training helping him recognize that they'd discovered something genuinely significant. If there's a hidden staircase, there might be hidden rooms, maybe even hidden chambers that no one's documented. Jamie had already started up the stairs, his phone's flashlight adding its smaller beam to his father's more powerful illumination. "Dad, come look at this," he called from perhaps 20 steps above, his voice carrying the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. "The walls up here, they're covered with paintings." Following his son's voice, Marcus climbed the concealed staircase and found himself in a circular chamber that took his breath away. The tower's interior had been transformed into something extraordinary. A medieval scriptorium, complete with carved wooden desks, built-in shelves and wall paintings that depicted scenes from Scottish history with a level of detail and artistry that belonged in a museum. But it was what the chamber contained that made Marcus's pulse quicken. Ancient books, dozens of them, arranged on shelves that had been designed specifically for their preservation. Rolled documents secured with silk ribbons. Wooden chests with iron bindings that suggested they held treasures too precious to leave unprotected. "Jamie," Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with awe, "I think we found something that's been hidden for centuries. This isn't just a secret room. This is a medieval library, and it looks like it's been preserved exactly as it was meant to be." The boy moved carefully among the ancient furnishings, his natural curiosity tempered by an instinctive understanding that they were in the presence of something precious and irreplaceable. "Dad, look at this book," he whispered, pointing to a leather-bound volume that lay open on one of the wooden desks. "I can't read the writing, but the pictures are incredible." Marcus approached the open manuscript and felt his knees nearly buckle with shock. He was looking at an illuminated medieval chronicle, hand-lettered in Latin, with decorative capitals painted in gold leaf and brilliant colors that had remained vivid after centuries of preservation. The open pages depicted the Battle of Culloden with historical accuracy and artistic skill that made it priceless, both as historical document and art object. But this was just one book among dozens. As his eyes adjusted to the chamber's dim light, Marcus began to comprehend the scope of what they'd discovered. This wasn't just a hidden library. It was a treasure trove of Scottish historical documents that scholars had believed were lost forever. Chronicles of clan warfare, records of ancient land grants, illuminated copies of medieval poetry, genealogical documents that traced the lineages of Highland families back to their Celtic origins. Each book, each scroll, each carefully preserved document represented knowledge that historians would give anything to access. "Dad," Jamie said, his young voice filled with the weight of discovery, "how much do you think all these old books are worth?" Marcus looked around the chamber, mentally cataloging the medieval manuscripts, the ancient chronicles, the illuminated texts that represented centuries of Scottish scholarship and artistry. Conservative estimates for individual items would be in the tens of thousands of pounds. Complete collections like this, with provenance and historical significance, could be worth millions. But even as he calculated the potential financial value, Marcus understood that they'd discovered something far more precious than money. This was Scottish cultural heritage in its purest form, preserved by generations of guardians who had understood that some treasures transcended individual ownership. The implications were staggering. Ravenshollow Castle wasn't just a crumbling fortress. It was a repository of national treasures that had been protected in secret for centuries. The Blackwood family hadn't been eccentric caretakers of a useless ruin. They had been the guardians of Scotland's most precious historical documents. As they carefully explored the chamber, Documenting each discovery with Jamie's phone camera, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These weren't just valuable artifacts. They were irreplaceable pieces of Scotland's national memory. The question was no longer whether he could afford to keep the castle. The question was whether he could afford to let such treasures fall into the wrong hands. Outside the tower, the Highland mist was thickening into proper fog, and the ancient stones of Ravenshollow Castle seemed to whisper with the voices of all the guardians who had come before. Marcus realized that Alistair's inheritance wasn't just property and debt. It was a sacred trust that had been passed down through generations, waiting for someone who would understand both its value and its vulnerability. Looking at Jamie's face, illuminated by the glow of centuries-old manuscripts, Marcus saw the same wonder and determination that had driven him to become a curator in the first place. Perhaps this crumbling castle wasn't their burden after all. Perhaps it was their destiny. Dr. Elena Roswell arrived at Ravenshollow Castle on a crisp November morning that seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The call from Marcus had reached her at the University of Glasgow, where she served as Scotland's leading expert on medieval manuscripts, and his description of the Tower Library had prompted her to cancel 3 academic conferences and drive the winding Highland roads to this remote glen she'd never heard of. Marcus watched her examine the illuminated chronicle of Culloden with the reverence of someone who understood its true significance. They'd found it 2 days earlier, along with dozens of other manuscripts that transformed the castle from romantic ruin to priceless historical repository. Her expertise would determine whether their discoveries were genuine medieval treasures or elaborate later reproductions. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Roswell murmured, adjusting her specialized magnifying glass as she studied the manuscript's vellum pages. "The pigments, the binding techniques, the calligraphy style. Everything indicates authentic 13th century production. But these chronicles describe events that supposedly had no contemporary documentation." She was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in her early 40s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her enthusiasm was infectious, but it was tempered by the scholarly caution of someone who'd seen too many promising discoveries crumble under rigorous examination. "Tell me about your great-uncle," she said, settling into the tower chamber's single modern chair that Alistair had apparently added for his own research sessions. Academic circles knew him as a serious collector, but he never shared his sources or allowed scholars to examine his holdings. Marcus considered what little he actually knew about Alistair Blackwood, realizing how much remained mysterious about the man who'd spent 4 decades as the castle's guardian. He was intensely private, obsessed with Scottish history and preservation, but he never explained why this place meant so much to him, or what he was protecting. The Tower Library had revealed layers of complexity that went far beyond medieval manuscripts. Hidden compartments contained genealogical charts tracing Highland families back to their origins, architectural drawings showing the castle's secret passages and concealed chambers, and correspondence suggesting that Ravenshollow had served purposes that had required absolute secrecy for centuries. Jamie had become indispensable to their research, his natural curiosity leading to discoveries that adult eyes missed. While Dr. Roswell examined manuscripts with professional expertise, the boy explored the chamber's physical structure with the thoroughness of someone who saw mystery in every shadow and possibility in every carved detail. "Dr. Roswell, look at this," Jamie called from behind one of the wooden shelves, his voice carrying the excitement that had led to all their previous breakthroughs. "There's another door back here, but it's hidden behind the books." The discovery revealed a second chamber, smaller than the scriptorium but containing treasures that made Dr. Roswell inhale sharply. Medieval religious artifacts, golden chalices encrusted with precious stones, illuminated prayer books bound in covers that sparkled with embedded gems. These weren't just historical documents. They were sacred objects that belonged in the most prestigious museums in the world. "Marcus," Dr. Roswell said quietly, her voice filled with awe, "what you've inherited isn't just a castle library. This is a medieval treasury, the kind of collection that kings and abbots accumulated over lifetimes. The financial value would be astronomical, but the historical significance is beyond measure." The implications sent Marcus's mind racing through possibilities and complications in equal measure. If Dr. Roswell's assessment was accurate, the castle's hidden treasures could solve all their financial problems, while making Ravenshollow one of Scotland's most important historical sites. But such discoveries would also attract attention from people who saw opportunity rather than obligation, who might not share the Blackwood family's apparent commitment to preservation and protection. Word of their discoveries had already begun spreading through academic circles, despite Dr. Roswell's attempts at discretion. Her initial assessment had required consultation with colleagues who specialized in different aspects of medieval scholarship, and each expert who examined photographs of their findings had recognized the collection's extraordinary significance. The phone calls had started within days, initially from universities and museums offering collaboration, expertise, and funding for proper preservation and study. But Marcus had also received inquiries from private collectors, antiquities dealers, and investment firms that specialized in high-value historical assets. Their interest felt different, more predatory, focused on acquisition rather than preservation. James Cromwell had been the most persistent of these commercial interests. His development company, Highland Heritage Holdings, specialized in transforming Scottish castles into luxury hotels, conference centers, and exclusive residential developments. Cromwell's initial approach had been respectful, even sympathetic, acknowledging the challenges of maintaining such a property while emphasizing his company's commitment to historical preservation. "Mr. Blackwood," Cromwell had said during their first phone conversation, his accent carrying the polished tones of someone accustomed to persuading people to make decisions they might later regret, "I understand you're facing significant financial pressures. Castle maintenance is enormously expensive, and proper preservation of historical artifacts requires resources and expertise that go far beyond individual capability." The offer was substantial, enough to pay off all of Marcus's debts while providing a comfortable trust fund for Jamie's education and future. Highland Heritage would purchase the castle and surrounding lands, then transform Ravenshollow into an exclusive historical resort while ensuring that the medieval treasures received professional conservation and appropriate public display. But something about Cromwell's approach made Marcus uncomfortable. The developer's questions focused more on the artifacts, portability, and market value than on their historical context or cultural significance. His preservation plans sounded impressive but vague, emphasizing luxury amenities and revenue generation rather than scholarly access or educational programming. Dr. Roswell had warned Marcus about the complexities of owning such historically significant artifacts. Collections like this attract attention from people who don't necessarily share your commitment to preservation, she'd explained during one of her research visits. There are collectors who would pay enormous sums for individual pieces, dealers who specialize in moving artifacts across international borders, and investors who see medieval treasures as portfolio diversification. The warning proved prophetic sooner than expected. Within a week of Dr. Roswell's initial assessment, Marcus began noticing strangers in Glen Morvern, well-dressed visitors who asked casual questions about the castle and its recent activities. Mrs. Ferguson at the bed and breakfast mentioned that several guests had inquired about local history and seemed particularly interested in the Blackwood family's connection to Ravenshollow. More concerning were the direct approaches. A representative from an anonymous private collector offered to purchase specific manuscripts sight unseen, with payment in cash and no questions asked about provenance or legal ownership. An antiquities dealer from London suggested that certain artifacts might be safer in secure private collections rather than remaining in an isolated Highland castle without proper security systems. Jamie had developed a gift for recognizing these commercial interests, his childhood intuition cutting through adult diplomatic language to identify people whose motives felt wrong. "Dad," he'd said after one particularly smooth stranger had tried to engage him in conversation about the castle's treasures, "that man didn't really care about the stories. He just wanted to know what things were worth." The boy's observation was astute. The commercial inquiries focused on monetary value rather than historical significance, on individual objects rather than the collection's integrity as a whole. These people saw Ravenshallow's treasures as commodities to be acquired, sold, and traded, rather than cultural heritage to be preserved and shared. But Marcus also faced practical concerns that couldn't be dismissed, simply because the commercial interests felt predatory. The castle required immediate structural repairs to prevent further deterioration, and proper conservation of the medieval artifacts demanded climate-controlled storage, security systems, and professional expertise that would cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. His savings had been exhausted by Catherine's medical bills, and his irregular income from freelance museum work couldn't begin to address Ravenshollow's needs. Even with grants and donations from historical preservation societies, the financial burden threatened to overwhelm his family's resources while potentially forcing him to sell individual artifacts just to fund the collection's proper care. The village opinion had shifted as word of the discoveries spread, but not necessarily in Marcus's favor. While some residents expressed pride in having such historically significant treasures in their community, others worried about the attention and disruption that a major archaeological site might bring to their quiet Highland glen. Hamish MacLeod had become increasingly vocal about his concerns during evening conversations at the village pub. "Treasure hunters and tourist buses, that's what we'll get," he declared to anyone who would listen. "Peace and quiet we've had for generations, and now we'll have crowds tramping through our hills looking for more castles to plunder." The concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Dr. Roswell had mentioned that discoveries of this magnitude typically attracted media attention, academic delegations, and tourist interest that could transform a remote Highland community in ways that longtime residents might not appreciate. Proper management of such attention required planning, resources, and expertise that neither Marcus nor the village currently possessed. Mrs. Ferguson had taken a more optimistic view, recognizing the potential economic benefits that historical tourism might bring to Glen Morvern. "We've struggled for years with young people leaving for the cities," she'd pointed out during one of Marcus's visits to collect mail and supplies. "If the castle brings visitors, maybe we'll have opportunities for shops, restaurants, tour guides. Could be the best thing that's happened to this place in decades." But even supportive community members recognized the challenges that came with sudden historical significance. Proper preservation would require collaboration with government agencies, compliance with heritage protection regulations, and coordination with academic institutions that had their own agendas and requirements. Dr. Roswell had begun introducing Marcus to the bureaucratic complexities of managing nationally significant historical sites. "Historic Environment Scotland will need to evaluate the collection," she'd explained, "and they'll have requirements for public access, conservation standards, and educational programming. The process can take years, and the regulations are quite strict about what private owners can and cannot do with protected artifacts." The regulatory framework was designed to protect Scotland's cultural heritage, but it also limited Marcus's options for managing the collection according to his family's needs and values. Government oversight might ensure proper preservation, but it could also mean losing control over how the artifacts were displayed, studied, and shared with the public. As winter approached and the Highland weather made the castle increasingly difficult to access, Marcus found himself caught between competing pressures that seemed to intensify daily. Cromwell's offers had become more aggressive, with suggestions that delaying a decision might result in deteriorating conditions that could damage the artifacts irreparably. Academic institutions had begun making their own proposals, offering to house the collection in climate-controlled university libraries, while providing Marcus with research fellowships and modest compensation for his cooperation. These approaches felt more respectful than the commercial inquiries, but they still represented a loss of family control over treasures that had been protected by Blackwood guardians for centuries. The pressure mounted when Dr. Roswell discovered evidence that the collection was even more significant than her initial assessment had suggested. Hidden compartments in the treasury chamber contained documents that appeared to be original charters from medieval Scottish kings, land grants that had shaped Highland history, and correspondence between clan leaders that revealed political alliances and conflicts that historians had only guessed at. "Marcus," she said during her most recent visit, her excitement barely contained despite her professional demeanor, "these documents could rewrite our understanding of medieval Scottish politics. You're not just preserving artifacts, you're protecting primary source materials that could change how historians view an entire period of our nation's development." But national historical significance came with national-level complications. Word of the royal charters had reached government officials in Edinburgh, and Marcus had received formal inquiries from Historic Environment Scotland about the collection's status, security arrangements, and plans for scholarly access. The inquiries were polite but pointed, emphasizing the government's responsibility to ensure that nationally significant artifacts received appropriate protection and remained accessible to researchers and the public. The subtext was clear. Private ownership of such treasures carried obligations that might be difficult for individual families to fulfill. Standing in the castle's great hall as another Highland storm battered the ancient walls, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility that had driven Alistair to spend 4 decades as a solitary guardian. The treasures upstairs represented more than financial value. They were the cultural memory of Scotland itself, preserved by generations of people who had understood that some things transcended individual ownership. But understanding the collection's significance didn't automatically provide solutions to the practical challenges of preservation, protection, and proper stewardship. Marcus was a single father with limited resources, facing pressures from commercial interests, academic institutions, and government agencies that all had their own ideas about how Ravenshallow's treasures should be managed. Jamie had been watching his father's growing stress with the perceptive concern that children often show when they sense that adult decisions will affect their entire future. "Dad," he'd said during one of their evening conversations in their temporary lodgings at Mrs. Ferguson's bed and breakfast, "are we going to lose the castle like we lost our house in Edinburgh?" The question cut to the heart of Marcus's fears. He'd already lost his wife, his home, and his secure career. The idea of losing the castle and its treasures to people who might not share his family's commitment to preservation felt like another failure, another instance of being unable to protect what mattered most. But looking at Jamie's face, seeing the boy's obvious love for the castle and its mysteries, Marcus realized that his son was learning more than just history from their discoveries. He was learning about courage, about the importance of protecting valuable things even when it was difficult, about standing up for principles that couldn't be measured in monetary terms. That evening, as they prepared for another night away from the castle while Marcus wrestled with decisions that would determine their entire future, Jamie made a discovery that would prove to be the most significant yet. While exploring Mrs. Ferguson's extensive collection of local history books, he'd found a leather-bound journal that the bed and breakfast owner had inherited from her grandmother, a woman who'd worked as a housekeeper at Ravenshollow during the early 20th century. The journal contained entries that painted a picture of Alistair's secret life as the guardian of Scotland's hidden treasures, but it also revealed information that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about the castle's true significance and the extent of the inheritance he'd received. The housekeeper's journal revealed secrets that transformed everything Marcus thought he understood about Ravenshollow Castle and the Blackwood family's centuries-long guardianship. Margaret Ferguson, Mrs. Ferguson's grandmother, had worked at the castle from 1923 until Alistair's father died in 1958, and her careful observations painted a picture of systematic treasure protection that went far beyond anything Marcus had imagined. The entries described elaborate security measures that Alistair's father had maintained throughout his lifetime, including hidden chambers that weren't marked on any architectural plans and concealment systems that had protected the medieval collection through 2 world wars and countless government inspections. But most shocking were Margaret's descriptions of artifacts that Marcus and Jamie hadn't yet discovered, treasures that suggested the Tower Library and Treasury were only small portions of a much larger hoard. Mr. Blackwood would disappear for hours into sections of the castle that seemed empty, Margaret had written in her precise handwriting. But I learned that nothing at Ravenshollow was ever truly empty. The walls themselves held secrets that only the family knew, and sometimes I would hear sounds from chambers that supposedly didn't exist. The journal's most significant revelation came in an entry dated December 1943, when Margaret described helping Alistair's father conceal the crown jewels of the Lost Kingdom in a vault that required 3 separate keys to open. The description was tantalizing but vague, referring to treasures that had been hidden at Ravenshollow during Scotland's darkest hours and never returned to their original locations. Dr. Roswell's expertise in medieval history helped interpret Margaret's cryptic references. "She's describing artifacts from the Kingdom of the Isles," the scholar explained, her excitement barely contained as she studied photocopies of the journal pages. That was a medieval Scottish kingdom that controlled the Hebrides and parts of the Western Highlands. Most historians believe their royal regalia was lost when the kingdom fell, but Margaret's description suggests it was hidden rather than destroyed. The Kingdom of the Isles had been one of Scotland's most powerful medieval realms, controlling sea routes and trade networks that made its rulers enormously wealthy. Archaeological evidence suggested that their royal treasures had included crowns, scepters, and ceremonial weapons decorated with precious stones and crafted by the finest artisans of their era. Such artifacts would be priceless, both as historical objects and as examples of medieval Scottish craftsmanship. But Margaret's journal also revealed the dangers that had prompted such elaborate concealment. During both World Wars, government agents had searched Highland castles for valuables that could support the war effort, and private collectors had used the chaos to acquire artifacts through means that weren't always legal or ethical. The Blackwood family had protected their treasures by making Ravenshollow appear less significant than it actually was, maintaining the fiction that the castle was a romantic ruin rather than a functioning repository. Jamie's interpretation of Margaret's clues led them to areas of the castle that even Alistair's architectural surveys hadn't documented. The boy's natural curiosity and systematic approach to exploration uncovered inconsistencies in wall thicknesses, variations in stone types, and acoustic anomalies that suggested hidden spaces behind apparently solid masonry. "Dad, listen to this," Jamie said, tapping on a section of wall in the castle's oldest tower. "It sounds different here, like there's an empty space behind these stones." The discovery of the concealed entrance required careful archaeological techniques that Dr. Roswell had learned during her graduate training. Unlike the tower library's sophisticated lock mechanism, this entrance had been sealed with mortar and stone, designed to be invisible rather than merely secured. Opening it required removing carefully selected stones without damaging whatever lay behind the wall. The chamber they revealed exceeded even Dr. Roswell's elevated expectations. The vault was larger than both the library and treasury combined, its walls lined with display cases that protected artifacts in climate-controlled environments that had somehow maintained perfect conditions for decades. The engineering required for such preservation would have been impressive in a modern museum, but in a medieval castle, it represented ingenuity that bordered on genius. The crown jewels of the Kingdom of the Isles lay in the vault's central case, their gold and precious stones catching the light from Marcus's flashlight in ways that made the artifacts seem almost alive. The royal crown was a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, its design incorporating Celtic motifs with Norse influences that reflected the kingdom's unique cultural position between Scotland and Scandinavia. But the crown was just one piece of a collection that represented the complete royal regalia of a lost kingdom. Ceremonial swords with hilts encrusted with rubies and sapphires, golden chalices designed for royal ceremonies, illuminated manuscripts that recorded the kingdom's laws and customs, silver platters bearing the royal coat of arms and precious metalwork that had taken master craftsmen years to complete. "Marcus," Dr. Roswell whispered, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of their discovery. "This collection is beyond anything I've ever seen outside the Tower of London. The historical value alone would be incalculable, but the monetary worth could easily exceed hundreds of millions of pounds." The assessment made Marcus's hands tremble as he considered the implications. They weren't just looking at valuable artifacts. They were looking at one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in Scottish history, a find that would revolutionize understanding of medieval politics, culture, and craftsmanship, while providing enough financial resources to solve any problem his family might ever face. But the discovery also intensified every pressure and complication they'd been facing. Word of the crown jewels would inevitably reach the highest levels of government, academic institutions around the world, and commercial interests that specialized in acquiring artifacts of exceptional value. The quiet Highland Glen would become the center of international attention that could overwhelm the community and threaten the very preservation that had protected the treasures for centuries. James Cromwell's response to rumors about the expanded discovery was swift and aggressive. His latest offer included not just the castle purchase, but provisions for immediate artifact removal to secure facilities that could provide appropriate protection while the collection underwent professional evaluation. The language was diplomatic, but the subtext was clear. Highland Heritage Holdings wanted to acquire the treasures before government regulations or academic claims could complicate their commercial plans. "Mr. Blackwood," Cromwell said during an unannounced visit that caught Marcus off guard, "discoveries of this magnitude require professional management that goes far beyond individual capability. My company has relationships with major auction houses and private collectors who could ensure that these artifacts receive the recognition and financial appreciation they deserve." The developer's approach had evolved from respectful persuasion to barely concealed pressure. His questions focused on Marcus's ability to provide adequate security, proper conservation, and legal compliance with heritage protection laws that were becoming increasingly complex as the collection's significance became apparent. The implicit threat was that failure to meet professional standards could result in government seizure or legal challenges that would cost Marcus both the artifacts and his inheritance. Dr. Roswell had warned Marcus about such tactics, explaining how commercial interests often used regulatory complexity to pressure artifact owners into quick sales that avoided lengthy government review processes. "The moment this discovery becomes public knowledge," she'd said, "you'll face pressures from people who see these treasures as business opportunities rather than cultural heritage." The academic community's response was more respectful but equally intense. Universities across Scotland and England had begun making inquiries about research access, collaborative preservation projects, and institutional partnerships that would ensure scholarly study while providing Marcus with academic affiliations and modest financial compensation. These approaches felt more ethical than Cromwell's commercial pressure, but they still represented potential loss of family control over artifacts that had been protected by Blackwood guardians for centuries. Professor William Mackenzie from the University of Edinburgh had presented the most comprehensive academic proposal, offering to establish Ravenshollow as a research center that would attract scholars from around the world while maintaining the castle as the collection's permanent home. The plan included funding for structural restoration, state-of-the-art conservation facilities, and educational programs that would share the artifacts' significance with students and the general public. "Mr. Blackwood," Professor Mackenzie had explained during his visit to examine the crown jewels, "this discovery represents a unique opportunity to create something unprecedented in Scottish academia. Ravenshollow could become a living laboratory where students and scholars work together to understand our medieval heritage while ensuring that these treasures remain accessible to future generations." The academic proposal addressed many of Marcus's concerns about preservation and public access, while respecting the Blackwood family's traditional role as guardians. But it also involved surrendering significant control to institutional oversight, academic committees and government agencies that might have their own agendas for how the collection should be managed and displayed. Meanwhile, the Scottish government's interest had escalated beyond polite inquiries to formal assessments that would determine the collection's status under national heritage protection laws. Historic Environment Scotland had dispatched a team of experts to evaluate the artifacts and determine what regulatory requirements would apply to their continued private ownership. The government officials were professional and respectful, but their questions revealed the complexity of laws designed to protect nationally significant artifacts while balancing private ownership rights with public interest. The crown jewels, in particular, would likely be classified as treasures of national importance that carried strict requirements for security, conservation, and public access. Sarah Morrison, the lead government assessor, had been frank about the challenges Marcus would face as a private owner of such significant artifacts. "Mr. Blackwood," she'd explain, "while we certainly respect your family's historic guardianship, artifacts of this caliber require security measures, conservation facilities, and management expertise that typically exceed individual resources. The assessment team would need several weeks to complete their evaluation, but their preliminary findings suggested that continued private ownership would require Marcus to meet professional museum standards for artifact care, security systems, and public access programs. The costs and complexity of such requirements could easily overwhelm his financial resources while transforming Ravenshollow from family home to public institution." Village opinion had become increasingly divided as news of the crown jewels spread throughout Glen Morvern and beyond. Some residents expressed pride in their community's connection to such historically significant treasures, recognizing the potential for tourism revenue and international recognition that could revitalize their struggling Highland economy. Mrs. Ferguson had embraced her role as an unofficial spokesperson for the pro-preservation faction, organizing community meetings where residents could learn about the collection's significance and discuss how to manage the changes that major archaeological discoveries inevitably brought to small communities. "We've been sitting next to one of Scotland's greatest treasures for generations without knowing it," she declared during one particularly well-attended village meeting. "Now that we know what we have, we owe it to ourselves and to Scotland to make sure these artifacts are protected and shared properly." But Hamish MacLeod had emerged as the leader of residents who worried that international attention would disrupt their traditional way of life, bringing crowds, traffic, and commercial development that would transform Glen Morvern beyond recognition. His concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Archaeological discoveries of this magnitude often triggered tourism booms that could overwhelm small communities unprepared for sudden influxes of visitors. Peace and quiet we've had here for centuries, Hamish had argued during the same village meeting. And now we're supposed to welcome busloads of tourists trampling through our hills, looking for more treasures to cart away. What happens to our way of life when every stone wall becomes a potential archaeological site? The community debate reflected broader questions about how Scotland should balance heritage preservation with economic development, academic access with community autonomy, and international significance with local control. These weren't abstract policy questions. They were immediate practical concerns that would determine Glen Morvern's future and Marcus's family's place in it. Jamie had been following the adult discussions with the intense interest that he brought to everything connected with the castle's mysteries. His perspective, informed by childhood logic uncomplicated by adult political considerations, often cut to the heart of issues that grown-ups made unnecessarily complex. "Dad," he'd said after listening to one particularly heated debate about government oversight versus family guardianship, "why can't we just keep taking care of the treasures like Uncle Alistair and his family did? They protected everything for hundreds of years without all these meetings and arguments." The question was astute, highlighting the disconnect between traditional guardianship methods that had successfully preserved the collection for centuries and modern regulatory frameworks that emphasized institutional oversight and professional management. The Blackwood family's approach had been based on personal commitment and generational responsibility, while contemporary preservation models relied on bureaucratic structures and legal compliance. But Jamie's suggestion also revealed the challenge that Marcus faced in maintaining traditional guardianship in a modern context. Alistair had been able to protect the collection's secrets because few people knew about its existence, and those who did know shared his commitment to preservation over profit. Now that the treasure's significance was becoming public knowledge, secrecy was no longer possible, and protection would require resources and expertise that went beyond individual capability. The turning point came when Dr. Roswell discovered evidence that the crown jewels represented only a portion of the Kingdom of the Isles, royal treasury. Hidden references in the medieval manuscripts suggested that additional artifacts had been distributed among multiple Highland castles for safekeeping, and that Ravenshollow served as the central repository for a network of preservation sites that had protected Scotland's cultural heritage through centuries of political upheaval. "Marcus," Dr. Roswell said, her voice trembling with excitement as she translated passages from a 13th century chronicle, "these documents describe a systematic effort to preserve the royal artifacts of multiple Scottish kingdoms. Ravenshollow wasn't just hiding one collection, it was coordinating the protection of treasures from across medieval Scotland." The revelation suggested that the castle's true significance went far beyond even the crown jewels. Extraordinary value. If the manuscripts were accurate, Ravenshollow had served as the heart of a preservation network that had saved Scotland's cultural heritage from destruction during the kingdom's most turbulent periods. The implications for historical understanding and archaeological potential were staggering. But the discovery also meant that Marcus's inheritance included not just the artifacts they'd found, but potential claims to treasures that might be hidden in castles and sites across Scotland. The legal, political, and practical complications of such claims would make their current challenges seem simple by comparison, while attracting attention from people and institutions that might not share the Blackwood family's commitment to preservation and responsible stewardship. Standing in the vault surrounded by the crown jewels of a lost kingdom, Marcus realized that Alistair's inheritance was both more precious and more complicated than he'd ever imagined. The question was no longer whether he could afford to keep the castle and its treasures. The question was whether he could afford to let them fall into the wrong hands, knowing what they represented for Scotland's cultural memory and his family's centuries-long commitment to their protection. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.